The one where the enemies who try to conquer her world will become the allies who help build something better. Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She spent her whole life working toward this moment, and she got to see it, even if only from a distance. She got to know that it was possible. Vexrian was silent for a long moment, processing the weight of what she had shared. Then, slowly, his crest rose and Solari gestured profound respect. "Your species," he said, "remains the most extraordinary I have ever encountered, not because of your weapons or your technology or your tactical brilliance, but because of your capacity to hope, to believe in futures that do not yet exist and work to bring them into being. That's not uniquely human, High Admiral. Look around you." Elena gestured at the celebrating crowd. Every species here chose hope over despair. Every civilization represented in this chamber decided that the future could be better than the past. We're not special. We're just the ones who happen to be in a position to remind everyone else that the choice was possible. Perhaps. Vexrian's compound eyes swept across the diverse assembly. But you were the first in 40,000 years to make the Dominion face that choice. And because you did, all of this became possible. The celebrations continued long into the night, as they always did when the assembly welcomed a new member. The Kethvari delegates mingled with their new colleagues, learning the protocols and customs of community they had just joined. Trade agreements were discussed, cultural exchanges planned, scientific collaborations proposed. The work of building a better galaxy went on, as it had for 50 years, as it would for centuries to come. And somewhere in the vast chamber, surrounded by the representatives of species that had once been enemies and were now friends, an old Solari admiral and an old human diplomat shared a drink that neither of their physiologies was designed to process, toasting to the memory of the woman who had seen the future and refused to let it slip away. "To Elena Vasquez," Vexrian said, raising his glass. "To my grandmother," the younger Elena agreed, "and to everyone who chose hope." They drank. The celebrations continued. The galaxy turned on, vast and ancient and full of dangers that no one species could face alone. But they were not alone anymore. They were together, and that made all the difference. Surrender terms, integration procedures, the usual. Cathera's mandibles clicked in a gesture of contempt. "They have not responded at all, High Admiral. Our communication specialists believe they may not have even recognized the transmissions as artificial in origin. Remarkable." Vexrian turned from the viewing portal to face a subordinate directly. 40 millennia of civilization, and they have not developed basic quantum communication technology. How do they coordinate their species at all? Electromagnetic radiation, High Admiral. Radio waves, as they call them. Their signals take time to travel between points, and they are easily disrupted by stellar activity or atmospheric interference. Their fastest communications require physical cables or concentrated beam transmissions between stationary points. Barbaric. The word emerged as a hiss from Vexrian's throat sacs. Truly barbaric. I almost pity them, Cathera. They have achieved just enough technological sophistication to understand what they are losing, but not nearly enough to prevent its loss. Your compassion is noted, High Admiral, but perhaps misplaced. The intelligence reports indicate this species has a particularly violent history. They have used their primitive nuclear devices against their own population centers. They maintain standing armies numbering in the tens of millions. They have fought major planetary wars every few generations throughout their recorded history. Cathera's sensory tendrils curled in a gesture of mild concern. They may not submit peacefully. Then they will be pacified. Vexrian's tone carried no emotion. Standard suppression protocol. Orbital strikes on military installations first, followed by civilian infrastructure if resistance continues. We will maintain enough of the population to establish a viable labor caste, but no more. The Council has authorized a 70% reduction in native population, if necessary, to ensure compliance. Understood, High Admiral. Shall I give the order to bring the fleet to combat readiness? Vexrian considered the question for a long moment, watching the blue-green world grow steadily larger in the viewing portal. Somewhere down there, 8 billion primitive creatures were going about their brief, violent lives, completely unaware that their existence was about to be fundamentally altered. They could not even see the fleet approaching, their primitive detection technology blinded by Dominion's sensor-dampening fields. They would have no warning, no time to prepare, no chance to resist in any meaningful way. It was almost unsporting. "No," he said finally. "Maintain current status. There is no need for combat readiness against a world that cannot fight back. Bring us into high orbit and prepare the delegation shuttle. I will offer them one opportunity to surrender before we begin orbital suppression. You intend to speak with them personally, High Admiral? I intend to give them the chance to preserve as much of their population as possible. The Council wants this world intact for strategic purposes, and wholesale extermination would damage its industrial potential." Vexrian's crest flattened in what might have been a shrug. "Besides, I confess to some curiosity about these creatures. The intelligence reports describe them as remarkably resilient for such a primitive species. They have survived multiple extinction-level events and continue to proliferate despite their world's dangerous conditions. Perhaps they will prove more interesting than the usual colonial subjects." Kathera's compound eyes shifted in a pattern that suggested skepticism, but she did not voice her doubts. "As you command, High Admiral. I will have the delegation shuttle prepared within the hour." The shuttle descended through Earth's atmosphere with a deliberate slowness that was meant to be impressive rather than practical. The Solari had perfected gravitational manipulation technology millennia ago, and they could have dropped to the planet's relatively thin atmospheric layer in seconds if they chose. But Vexrian wanted the natives to see his approach. He wanted them to watch the sleek, predatory shape of the shuttle carving through their sky, surrounded by the shimmering distortion field of its protective barriers. He wanted them to understand, viscerally and immediately, that they were facing a power beyond anything their primitive minds could comprehend. The shuttle sensors painted a detailed picture of the landing zone as they descended. The Dominion had chosen a location in the heart of one of the natives' largest population centers, a sprawling urban area that their intelligence suggested served as a center of political and economic power. The buildings below were impressive by primitive standards, towering structures of glass and metal that stretched hundreds of meters into the sky. The streets between them were choked with ground vehicles and masses of the soft-bodied natives, going about their daily routines in blissful ignorance of what was descending upon them. That ignorance ended when the shuttle breached the cloud layer. The first reactions were subtle. A few of the ground vehicles slowed, then stopped. Pedestrians paused in their movement, tilting their heads upward. Within seconds, the pause had spread like a ripple across the entire visible area, millions of beings freezing in place as they caught sight of the alien vessel descending from their sky. The shuttle's audio sensors detected a rising cacophony of vocalizations from below, a wall of sound composed of screams, shouts, and what the translation algorithms identified as prayers to various supernatural entities. The natives' primitive flying machines began to scatter in all directions, their pilots desperately trying to put distance between themselves and the unknown threat. Emergency sirens began to wail from multiple points across the city. Military vehicles were already mobilizing the streets below, their crews scrambling to respond to what their limited sensors must be reporting as an impossibility. Vexrian observed all of this with detached interest from the shuttle's command deck. The panic below was predictable, even expected. Every primitive species reacted the same way to first contact with a superior civilization. The initial shock would give way to fear, then confusion, then eventually acceptance. It was simply a matter of demonstrating dominance, clearly enough that resistance became obviously futile. He had overseen 37 colonial operations during his career, and not once had a pre-spacefaring species failed to submit once they understood the magnitude of the power arrayed against them. Earth would be no different. The shuttle touched down in a large open plaza near the center of the city, its landing struts extending automatically to brace against the primitive stone surface. The protective barrier remained active, projecting a shimmering dome of energy that would deflect any attack the natives could conceivably mount. Through the shuttle's external sensors, Vexrian could see the military vehicles that had rushed to the scene, their crews deploying with weapons drawn. The weapons themselves were almost quaint, metal tubes designed to accelerate small projectiles through chemical propulsion. Some of the larger vehicles mounted what appear to be rotary variants capable of higher rates of fire, and a few carried tube-launched explosive devices that the intelligence reports had classified as anti-armor weapons. None of them posed any threat to the shuttle's shields. A single Dominion patrol craft could have neutralized every military asset visible in the plaza within seconds, and Vexrian had 47 dreadnoughts in orbit above their heads. The local authorities are attempting to communicate, reported the shuttle's communications officer. They are broadcasting on multiple electromagnetic frequencies, demanding identification, and requesting that we state our intentions. Translate my response and broadcast on all frequencies they are using, Vexrian commanded, rising from his seat and moving toward the shuttle's primary hatch. I am High Admiral Vexrian of the Dominion of Eternal Flame. I speak for the High Council of the Dominion, which claims this world and all its inhabitants as colonial subjects. I am prepared to discuss the terms of your species' surrender and integration into the Dominion's hierarchy. Send representatives to meet me outside this vessel within 1 of your hours, or I will interpret your silence as resistance and begin orbital suppression of your military installations. The message was transmitted. The reply came within minutes, a flood of overlapping signals from multiple sources, as the natives' fractured political structure scrambled to respond to the unprecedented situation. The translation algorithms worked overtime to parse the chaos, eventually isolating a single clear signal that appeared to come from the military forces surrounding the plaza. Unidentified vessel, you're ordered to remain in place. Representatives of the United Nations are being assembled and will arrive within the hour. We request that you maintain a non-hostile posture until diplomatic channels can be established. United Nations. The intelligence reports had mentioned this organization, a loose confederation that attempted to coordinate between the natives' various competing governments. It was a primitive arrangement, lacking any real authority to compel compliance from its member states, but would serve as a point of contact. Vexrian authorized the shuttle's external hatch to open and stepped out onto the ramp, deliberately positioning himself so that the gathered military forces could see him clearly. The reaction was immediate and visceral. The natives nearest to the shuttle took several steps backward, their faces contorting in expressions that the behavioral algorithms identified as extreme fear and revulsion. Vexrian understood their reaction. The Solari form was dramatically alien by their standards, and his full ceremonial armor only emphasized the differences. He towered over the largest of them by nearly a meter, his scaled skin gleaming with the iridescent patterns that marked his rank and lineage. His crest was fully extended, projecting an image of dominance and authority. His compound eyes swept across the assembled crowd, taking in every detail with an intensity that the natives clearly found unsettling. Several of the military personnel had raised their weapons, but none had fired. Good. They retained enough rationality to recognize the futility of attacking a clearly superior force. The hour that followed was filled with tense waiting. More military vehicles arrived, forming a perimeter around the plaza that grew steadily thicker as time passed. The crowds of civilians were pushed back by uniformed personnel, though many refused to leave entirely, gathering at the edges of the containment zone to stare and point and vocalize to each other in patterns that suggested both fear and fascination. News-gathering vehicles arrived, their crews deploying observation equipment that Vexrian recognized as primitive electromagnetic recording devices. They were documenting everything, broadcasting images across their global communication network. By now, every being on this planet would know that they were no longer alone in the universe. The diplomatic delegation arrived precisely at the 1-hour mark, a procession of ground vehicles that pushed through the military perimeter and came to a stop at the edge of the shuttle's protective barrier. The beings that emerged were an unusual collection, clearly drawn from multiple ethnic and national backgrounds based on a variation in their physical features and dress. They moved with the careful deliberation of creatures who were very aware that they were walking into an unknown and potentially deadly situation, but their faces showed determination rather than panic. One of them stepped forward, a female of moderate age whose gray-streaked hair and formal attire suggested high status. "I am Secretary General Elena Vasquez of the United Nations," she announced, her voice steady despite the obvious stress in her vital signs. "I speak for the nations of Earth. We have received your transmission and understand your claims. Before we proceed, I must ask a question that I believe is of critical importance. Speak, Vexrian permitted. You claim to represent an interstellar empire. You arrive in our skies with technology far beyond anything we possess. You speak of surrender and integration. She paused, meeting his compound eyes with a directness that surprised him. What I need to know, High Admiral, is whether there is any path to a peaceful relationship between our peoples that does not involve the subjugation of humanity. Vexrian considered the question. It was more sophisticated than he had expected from a primitive, touching on the fundamental nature of the Dominion's colonial philosophy. He decided to answer honestly. The truth, after all, would only underscore the inevitability of the situation. The Dominion of the Eternal Flame has existed for 40,000 years, he said. In that time, we have encountered 117 sapient species. All of them now serve the Dominion in various capacities, according to their capabilities and their willingness to cooperate. Some races were integrated peacefully, accepting their role in our hierarchy in exchange for protection and advancement that the Dominion provides. Others resisted and were pacified through military force. The outcome, in the end, was the same. He paused, allowing his words to be translated and absorbed. There is no path, Secretary General, in which your species remains independent. The only choice before you is whether that integration occurs peacefully, with your people retained as productive labor caste, or violently, with your population reduced to whatever minimum is necessary to serve our purposes. The Secretary General's face showed a complex mixture of emotions that the behavioral algorithm struggled to classify. Fear, certainly. Anger. But also something else. Something that looked almost like calculation. I see, she said slowly. And if we choose to resist? If we refuse to surrender? Then we will begin orbital suppression immediately. Your military installations will be destroyed first, followed by your communication and transportation infrastructure. If resistance continues, we will proceed to population centers, beginning with the largest and working downward until compliance is achieved. Vexrian's tone remained flat, clinical. I have 47 dreadnoughts in orbit above your world, each one capable of reducing a city the size of this one to ash in seconds. Your primitive weapons cannot reach them, cannot harm them, cannot do anything except delay the inevitable at the cost of your own lives. May I consult with my colleagues before providing our response? You may take 1 hour. I suggest you use the time to explain the situation to your various governments and secure their authorization to surrender. A unified response will simplify the integration process considerably. The Secretary General nodded slowly, then turned and walked back to her delegation. They gathered in a tight circle, speaking in low tones that the shuttle sensors could easily pick up despite their attempt at privacy. The conversation was animated, filled with emotional gestures, and what appeared to be significant disagreement. Vexrian watched with mild interest, wondering which faction would prevail. The realists who understood the futility of resistance, or the idealists who would rather die than submit. In his experience, the realists usually won in the end. Survival was a powerful motivator. The hour passed. The Secretary General returned to the edge of the barrier, her face set in an expression that the behavioral algorithms now confidently identified as grim determination. High Admiral, she began, I have consulted with the leaders of Earth's nations. We have reviewed your terms and considered our options carefully. Before I deliver our response, I need to share some information with you that may be relevant to the situation. Vexrian's crest shifted slightly, indicating curiosity. Proceed. You described your scans of our world. You noted our reliance on chemical propulsion, our primitive communication systems, our kinetic weapons. You concluded that we pose no threat to your vessels or your empire. She paused, and something in her expression changed, a subtle hardening that the algorithms flagged as significant. You were looking at our civilian technology, High Admiral, our commercial infrastructure, our public-facing capabilities. I failed to see the distinction. Our scans were comprehensive. Were they? The Secretary General's voice carried a note that Vexrian could not immediately identify. You observed our world for 6 years, according to your own statements. 6 years of watching our broadcasts, monitoring our communications, cataloging our visible technology. But High Admiral, you were watching from beyond our moon. And there are things we don't talk about on open channels. Things we don't show to observers we know might be watching. A cold sensation began to spread through Vexrian's thorax, an instinctive response that his species had evolved over millions of years of predator-prey dynamics. It was a feeling of realizing that a situation was not what it appeared to be. "Explain yourself," he demanded. "Earth has been aware of the possibility of extraterrestrial life for more than a century," the Secretary General continued. "We've been actively searching for signs of intelligent life in the cosmos since before we achieved spaceflight, and we've been preparing for the possibility of hostile contact for nearly as long. Not publicly, of course. Our populations weren't ready for that knowledge. But quietly, in facilities hidden from civilian observation, with budgets buried in defense allocations and black projects, we've been getting ready." She reached into her jacket and produced a small device, a communication unit of some kind. "I'm going to make a call now. High Admiral, I suggest you contact your fleet." Before Vexrian could respond, the Secretary General pressed a button on the device and spoke a single word. "Prometheus." For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the shuttle's communication systems erupted with overlapping emergency signals from the fleet in orbit, and Vexrian felt his crest flatten against his skull in a response he had not experienced since his earliest combat training. The first reports were confused, fragmented, impossible to reconcile with the intelligent assessments that had shaped this entire operation. Contact appearing throughout the system. Ships emerging from behind planetary bodies, from asteroid clusters, from the shadow of the system's gas giants. Human ships. Hundreds of them. Thousands of them. Ships that the Dominion sensors had never detected, that had apparently been there all along, waiting in the darkness between worlds. "High Admiral, we are detecting massive energy signatures from the third planet's surface." Sub-Admiral Cathura's voice came through the communication link, and for the first time in their long association, Vexrian heard genuine alarm in her tone. The signatures were not present in previous scans. They appeared to be coming from beneath the surface, from underground installations that we completely failed to detect. "High Admiral, they're launching. The natives are launching from their planet, and the numbers are still climbing." Vexrian turned to face the Secretary General, his compound eyes taking in every detail of her expression with new understanding. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid. The fear he thought he'd seen in her vital signs had been anticipation, the elevated heart rate and respiration of a predator preparing to spring a trap. "You knew we were coming," he said. "We knew someone would come eventually," she corrected. "The universe is too large and too old for us to be alone, and your species was not subtle in its approach. We detected your scout vessel 6 years ago. High Admiral, we watched you watch us, and we let you see exactly what we wanted you to see. Your civilian technology, your primitive public infrastructure, our masks." The Secretary General's expression was hard now, all pretense of diplomatic deference stripped away. "You came to conquer a sleeping primitive. There is no path, Secretary General, in which your species remains independent. The only choice before you is whether that integration occurs peacefully, with your people retained as productive labor caste, or violently, with your population reduced to whatever minimum is necessary to serve our purposes." The Secretary General's face showed a complex mixture of emotions that the behavioral algorithm struggled to classify. Fear, certainly. Anger. But also something else. Something that looked almost like calculation. "I see," she said slowly. "And if we choose to resist, if we refuse to surrender, then we will begin orbital suppression immediately. Your military installations will be destroyed first, followed by your communication and transportation infrastructure. If resistance continues, we will proceed to population centers, beginning with the largest and working downward until compliance is achieved." Vexrian's tone remained flat, clinical. "I have 47 dreadnoughts in orbit above your world, each one capable of reducing a city the size of this one to ash in seconds. Your primitive weapons cannot reach them, cannot harm them, cannot do anything except delay the inevitable at the cost of your own lives. May I consult with my colleagues before providing our response? You may take 1 hour. I suggest you use the time to explain the situation to your various governments and secure their authorization to surrender. A unified response will simplify the integration process considerably. The Secretary General nodded slowly, then turned and walked back to her delegation. They gathered in a tight circle, speaking in low tones that the shuttle sensors could easily pick up despite their attempt at privacy. The conversation was animated, filled with emotional gestures, and what appeared to be significant disagreement. Vexrian watched with mild interest, wondering which faction would prevail: the realists who understood the futility of resistance, or the idealists who would rather die than submit. In his experience, the realists usually won in the end. Survival was a powerful motivator. The hour passed. The Secretary General returned to the edge of the barrier, her face set in an expression that the behavioral algorithms now confidently identified as grim determination. "High Admiral," she began, "I have consulted with the leaders of Earth's nations. We have reviewed your terms and considered our options carefully. Before I deliver our response, I need to share some information with you that may be relevant to the situation." Vexrian's crest shifted slightly, indicating curiosity. "Proceed." "You described your scans of our world. You noted our reliance on chemical propulsion, our primitive communication systems, our kinetic weapons. You concluded that we pose no threat to your vessels or your empire." She paused, and something in her expression changed, a subtle hardening that the algorithms flagged as significant. "You were looking at our civilian technology, High Admiral, our commercial infrastructure, our public-facing capabilities." I failed to see the distinction. Our scans were comprehensive. "Were they?" The Secretary General's voice carried a note that Vexrian could not immediately identify. "You observed our world for 6 years, according to your own statements. 6 years of watching our broadcasts, monitoring our communications, cataloging our visible technology. But High Admiral, you were watching from beyond our moon, and there are things we don't talk about on open channels. Things we don't show to observers we know might be watching." A cold sensation began to spread through Vexrian's thorax, an instinctive response that his species had evolved over millions of years of predator-prey dynamics. It was a feeling of realizing that a situation was not what it appeared to be. "Explain yourself," he demanded. "Earth has been aware of the possibility of extraterrestrial life for more than a century," the Secretary General continued. "We've been actively searching for signs of intelligent life in the cosmos since before we achieved spaceflight, and we've been preparing for the possibility of hostile contact for nearly as long. Not publicly, of course. Our populations weren't ready for that knowledge. But quietly, in facilities hidden from civilian observation, with budgets buried in defense allocations and black projects, we've been getting ready." She reached into her jacket and produced a small device, a communication unit of some kind. "I'm going to make a call now. High Admiral, I suggest you contact your fleet." Before Vexrian could respond, the Secretary General pressed a button on the device and spoke a single word: "Prometheus." For a long moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the shuttle's communication systems erupted with overlapping emergency signals from the fleet in orbit, and Vexrian felt his crest flatten against his skull in a response he had not experienced since his earliest combat training. The first reports were confused, fragmented, impossible to reconcile with the intelligent assessments that had shaped this entire operation. Contact appearing throughout the system, ships emerging from behind planetary bodies, from asteroid clusters, from the shadow of the system's gas giants. Human ships, hundreds of them, thousands of them, ships that the Dominion sensors had never detected, that had apparently been there all along, waiting in the darkness between worlds. "High Admiral, we are detecting massive energy signatures from the third planet's surface." Sub-Admiral Cathura's voice came through the communication link, and for the first time in their long association, Vexrian heard genuine alarm in her tone. The signatures were not present in previous scans. They appeared to be coming from beneath the surface, from underground installations that we completely failed to detect. "High Admiral, they're launching. The natives are launching from their planet, and the numbers are still climbing." Vexrian turned to face the Secretary General, his compound eyes taking in every detail of her expression with new understanding. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid. The fear he thought he'd seen in her vital signs had been anticipation, the elevated heart rate and respiration of a predator preparing to spring a trap. "You knew we were coming," he said. "We knew someone would come eventually," she corrected. "The universe is too large and too old for us to be alone, and your species was not subtle in its approach. We detected your scout vessel 6 years ago. High Admiral, we watched you watch us, and we let you see exactly what we wanted you to see. Your civilian technology, your primitive public infrastructure, our masks." The Secretary General's expression was hard now, all pretense of diplomatic deference stripped away. "You came to conquer a sleeping primitive. You found a Deathworld that has been waiting for you since before your scout ever entered our system. The communication link with the fleet dissolved into chaos. Ships were reporting weapon signatures unlike anything in the Dominion's tactical databases. Kinetic projectiles moving at significant fractions of light speed. Directed energy weapons that operated on principles a tactical analysts could not immediately identify. Electronic warfare systems that were already attempting to penetrate the Dominion's communication encryption. And the human vessels themselves were unlike anything the initial surveys had suggested was possible. The reports painted a picture that made no sense within the framework of Dominion colonial doctrine. The human ships were not elegant or refined, not the graceful products of millennia of aesthetic evolution that characterized Dominion military design. They were brutal, angular things, all armor plating and weapon mounts and exposed thruster assemblies. They looked like they had been designed by a species that did not believe in non-essential components, that stripped everything down to the bare requirements of warfare, and added nothing more. They were ugly by Dominion standards. They were also terrifyingly functional. "High Admiral," Cathera's voice cut through the chaos. "The human vessels are moving to intercept. They are not responding to hails. Our shields are detecting targeting locks from multiple sources. High Admiral, I require authorization to return fire." Vexrian stood frozen on the shuttle ramp, his mind racing to process the fundamental shift in the strategic situation. Everything the Dominion had believed about this world, about this species, had been wrong. Not merely incomplete, but deliberately manipulated. The humans had known they were being observed. They had chosen what to reveal and what to conceal. They had built their real capabilities in secret, hidden them from detection, and waited with a patience that spoke of predatory intent. "High Admiral?" Cathera's voice was urgent now. "Return fire," Vexrian ordered, his voice hollow. "All ships, weapons free. Engage the human vessels with maximum force." The battle that followed would be studied by Dominion military academies for centuries, dissected and analyzed and used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions. The initial exchange of fire revealed just how badly the Dominion had misjudged their opponent. The human kinetic weapons, those primitive chemical-accelerated projectiles that the tactical analysts had dismissed as industrial tools, turned out to be merely the starting point of a weapons development philosophy that the Dominion had never encountered. The first human salvo came not from the ships themselves, but from the planet's surface. The underground installations that had escaped detection were not merely launch facilities. They were planet-based weapons platforms, rail guns and coil guns capable of accelerating projectiles to velocities that strained the ability of Dominion sensors to track. The projectiles themselves were not the simple metal slugs that the intelligence reports had described. They were sophisticated guided munitions capable of terminal maneuvering, equipped with penetrating warheads designed to bypass energy shielding through a combination of velocity and kinetic impact. The Dominion shields were designed to deflect directed energy weapons, the plasma lances and particle beams that had been the standard of galactic warfare for millennia. They were also effective against low-velocity physical impacts, the sort of debris and asteroid fragments that any spacefaring civilization would encounter during normal operations. What they were not designed to handle was a concentrated barrage of hypervelocity kinetic impactors, each one carrying the kinetic energy of a small nuclear device focused into a penetrating tip no larger than a human fist. The Dreadnought Glorious purpose was the first of all. It had moved to the front of the formation, positioning itself between the human vessels and the rest of the fleet in what its commander believed was a defensive posture. The ship's shields flickered briefly under the first wave of impacts, then stabilized. The The second wave triggered cascade failures in 3 shield emitters. The third wave penetrated the shields entirely, hammering into the dreadnought's hull with the force of divine judgment. The glorious purpose did not explode immediately. Instead, it simply came apart, its structural integrity failing under impacts that transferred kinetic energy to the hull like vibrations through a tuning fork. Secondary explosions followed as atmosphere vented through dozens of hull breaches, igniting fuel and ammunition stores in a chain reaction that ultimately consumed the vessel from within. The entire engagement, from first shot to final detonation, took less than 30 seconds. All ships, evasive maneuvers, Sub-Admiral Cathera commanded, her voice tight with a discipline that barely contained her shock. Disperse formation. Do not present cluster targets. Increase velocity and attempt to reach safe distance from the planetary weapons platforms. The fleet scattered, individual vessels breaking from formation and accelerating on divergent vectors. It was a correct tactical response, the response that Dominion doctrine prescribed for situations where an enemy possessed overwhelming defensive firepower. The problem was that the humans had anticipated this response and prepared accordingly. The vessels that had emerged from throughout the system were not merely a show of force. They were positioned with deliberate precision, blocking the most efficient escape vectors and forcing the Dominion ships into predetermined channels. As the dreadnoughts accelerated away from Earth, they found themselves being herded toward kill zones where human ships waited in optimal firing positions. The engagement transformed from a single concentrated battle into dozens of smaller skirmishes, each one favoring the human forces who had chosen the ground. Vexrian watched the tactical display in the shuttle's command center, his crest pressed flat against his skull in an expression of profound dismay. The humans were not fighting like primitives. They were not fighting like any species of Dominion had ever encountered. Their tactics showed a sophisticated understanding of three-dimensional warfare, of energy conservation and momentum management, and the fundamental physics of space combat. Their weapons, those supposedly primitive kinetic systems, were proving devastatingly effective against shields designed to counter energy weapons. And their ships, ugly and brutal and unsophisticated by Dominion aesthetic standards, were maneuvering with an aggression and coordination that suggested extensive training and preparation. We know how you've treated the species you've conquered. We know about the Veshkai and their molten homeworld. We know about the Mind Weavers and their shattered telepathic networks. We know what you intended to do to us. A pause. And we know that you're afraid right now. Afraid of what this defeat means to your empire, for your career, for your very survival. That fear is rational, High Admiral. You should be afraid. But you should also understand something fundamental about our species, something that your intelligence reports apparently failed to capture. What is that? We distinguish between combatants and prisoners. Once you surrender, you stop being an enemy and become a responsibility. We will not torture you for information. We will not execute you for propaganda value. We will not use you as hostages or bargaining chips. We will feed you, house you, and protect you from harm until we can return you to your people. Another pause. We do this not because we are weak, but because we choose to, because we decided long ago that how we treat our enemies says more about us than how we treat our friends. You came here expecting to find primitives. Instead, you found a species that has learned to be civilized despite our violent origins. Vexrian stood in silence, his compound eyes fixed on the distant flashes of light that marked the final moments of what had been the Dominion's third colonial fleet. Everything he had believed about this world, about this species, had been not merely wrong but inverted. The primitives were sophisticated. The weakness was strength. The prey was a predator that had been waiting in ambush since before he ever entered their system. "I need to speak with your leadership," he said finally, the words tasting like ash in his throat sacs. Not about surrender. Not yet. But about what comes next. What happens after this battle ends. That can be arranged, Captain Way acknowledged. Secretary General Vasquez is authorized to negotiate on behalf of the United Nations. But understand, High Admiral, that our terms are not negotiable. Your fleet has been destroyed. Your invasion has failed. The only question now is whether you will accept the consequences with grace, or whether you will force us to demonstrate even more clearly what happens when you threaten humanity's home. Vexrian turned to face the Secretary General, who had been watching the exchange with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "Your species," he said slowly, "is not what we expected." "No," she agreed. "We're what you should have expected, if you had been paying attention. Every dangerous world in the galaxy produces dangerous inhabitants. Every hostile environment selects for hostile traits. You looked at our blue oceans and green forests and thought you saw paradise. You should have looked at our history, at our wars and our plagues and our extinction events, and asked yourself what kind of creature could survive all of that and still reach for the stars." "A predator," Vexrian said. "The greatest predator this world ever produced." She extended her hand, a gesture that the cultural database has identified as one of peaceful greeting among humans. "Welcome to Earth, High Admiral. I sincerely hope you survive your visit." The final 6 Dominion vessels were captured within hours, their crew surrendering when it became clear that escape was impossible and that the humans' offer humane treatment was genuine. Vexrian himself was taken into custody aboard the unconquered Sun, where he was given quarters that were Spartan by Dominion standards, but surprisingly comfortable. The humans provided food that had been synthesized to match his species' nutritional requirements, evidence of a biochemical understanding far more sophisticated than the intelligence reports had suggested. They answered his questions with a patience that seemed almost excessive, explaining their history, their technology, their plans for the aftermath of this battle. What he learned in those first hours of captivity fundamentally restructured his understanding of the species he had come to conquer. The humans had been preparing for extraterrestrial contact since before they achieved orbital flight. The theoretical frameworks existed in their scientific literature, speculating about the nature of potential alien civilizations and the likely challenges of first contact. The practical preparations had begun in earnest after their detection of the Dominion scout vessel, but they had been building on decades of contingency planning and theoretical development. Their underground facilities, the ones that had launched the devastating surface-to-orbit strikes, had been constructed over a period of 40 years, hidden from satellite observation through a combination of deep excavation and sophisticated camouflage. Their military spacecraft, the ugly, brutal things that had dismantled his fleet, had been built in facilities on the far side of their moon and in stations orbiting the outer planets, kept hidden from any observer watching from beyond the system. They had known they were being watched. They had chosen to be underestimated. Why? Vexrian asked a human officer assigned to monitor his quarters, a calm professional named Commander Chun, who had answered his previous questions with admirable thoroughness. "Why hide your capabilities? Why let us believe you were primitive?" "Because we knew what on the assumption of technological superiority. Your fleets are designed to overwhelm opposition through superior firepower, not to fight against equals. Your tactics assume that energy weapons will always be more effective than kinetic systems. Your shields are optimized against the types of weapons that every advanced civilization in your experience has developed." Chun paused. "We deliberately designed our defenses to exploit those assumptions. Kinetic weapons because your shields are optimized for energy. Distributed launch platforms because your targeting systems are optimized for concentrated fleet engagements. Hidden capabilities because your intelligence doctrine assumes that visible technology represents actual capabilities. You design your entire military strategy to counter ours specifically. We designed our military strategy to counter any species that might threaten our homeworld. Your approach to colonization is not unique in the galaxy, High Admiral. The aggressive, expansionist, technologically superior empire is a pattern that emerges repeatedly in our theoretical models of interstellar civilization. We prepare to fight that pattern, regardless of which specific species embodied it." Vexrian's crest rose slowly, an involuntary expression of grudging respect. "You have been preparing for this moment for longer than we have been aware of your existence. We've been preparing for this moment since we first looked up at the stars and wondered if something might look back." Chen's voice carried no pride, only statement of fact. "Our species has a long history of being surprised by threats we failed to anticipate. Ice ages that came faster than expected. Diseases that spread faster than we could contain. Predators that were smarter than we assumed. Each time, we survived by adapting, by learning, by preparing for the next threat that we couldn't yet see. And what do you see now? What threat are you preparing for next?" Chin smiled, expression that the behavioral algorithms flagged as genuine amusement tinged with something harder. Your High Council, High Admiral. They're going to be very angry when they learn what happened here, and we're going to be ready for them. The battle for Earth, as it would come to be known in human histories, marked the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the political structure of a known galaxy. The broadcast transmissions that the humans have been sending throughout the engagement, the detailed tactical data, and visual recordings of Dominion vessels being destroyed by supposedly primitive kinetic weapons, reached every civilization within communication range within months. For species that had lived under Dominion colonial rule for centuries or millennia, the implications were revolutionary. The Dominion could be beaten. The Dominion's technological superiority was not absolute. There was a species in the third spiral arm that had proven both of these facts and was actively inviting others to join their resistance. The first defections began within a year. Small groups at first, individual dissidents and resistance cells who had never stopped dreaming of freedom despite the futility that the Dominion's overwhelming power seemed to guarantee. They found their way to human space through routes that the Dominion had never bothered to secure, guided by encrypted communications that human intelligence services distributed through channels that the Dominion surveillance systems had dismissed as background noise. The refugees brought with them technical knowledge, political intelligence, and most importantly, confirmation that the Dominion's subjected populations were far less content than their colonial administrators believed. The humans received them all. They established refugee processing stations on the outer world of their system, facilities designed to accommodate the biological diversity of a galaxy's worth of oppressed species. They learned the languages and customs of beings who had never been allowed to speak freely under Dominion rule. They listened to stories of atrocities, of cultural erasure, of entire civilizations reduced to servitude and extinction, and they documented everything, building a comprehensive record of what the Dominion had done in its 40,000 years of imperial expansion. Vexrian, still a prisoner despite the passage of time, watched these developments with a mixture of horror and fascination. The humans had not been exaggerating when they spoke of holding grudges. They were not merely preparing to defend themselves against the inevitable Dominion response. They were building a coalition, uniting the Dominion's victims into an alliance that could challenge the Empire on a galactic scale. And they were doing it with a patience and methodical precision that made the Dominion's own bureaucratic efficiency seem chaotic by comparison. "You are going to lose," he told Secretary General Vasquez during one of the periodic meetings that had become a strange feature of his captivity. The humans seemed to value his perspective on Dominion politics and military doctrine, and had found himself providing it with increasing honesty as the months passed. "You have won a battle, perhaps several battles. But the Dominion commands resources beyond anything you can imagine. 3,000 systems, trillions of subjects, industrial capacity that could replace the fleet you destroyed within a year." "We know," Vasquez acknowledged. She had aged noticeably since their first meeting, the stress of leading humanity through its first interstellar conflict taking a visible toll. But her eyes remained sharp, her voice steady. "We've analyzed your industrial data, your population distributions, your logistical capabilities. We know exactly how much force the Dominion can bring against us, and we know we cannot match it directly. Then why continue? Why provoke a conflict you cannot win? Because we don't need to win, High Admiral. We just need to make victory too expensive for you to afford." She smiled, and once again Vexrian saw the predator behind the diplomat's mask. "Your empire is built on the assumption of inevitable triumph. Every species you encounter has eventually submitted, because resistance seemed futile. But what happens when resistance is no longer futile? When every colony you threaten knows that Earth will provide weapons and training to help them fight back? When every system you garrison requires a permanent military presence to prevent uprising? When the cost of maintaining control exceeds the value of what you're controlling? You are describing a strategy of attrition, a war of 1,000 cuts rather than decisive victory. We're describing the strategy that kept every insurgency in human history alive against overwhelming force. The strategy that let small nations resist empires, that let partisans and guerrillas and resistance fighters hold out against enemies with absolute superiority in conventional warfare." Vasquez leaned forward. "The Dominion has never faced a real insurgency. High Admiral, your subjected populations have been too scattered, too demoralized, too convinced of your invincibility to mount effective resistance. But we're changing that. We're giving them hope and weapons and coordination. We're teaching them that the empire that has ruled their lives for millennia can bleed. The High Council will respond with overwhelming force. They will reduce your world to ash rather than allow you to continue spreading this poison. Perhaps, but doing so would prove our point, wouldn't it? Would demonstrate to every subjected species that the Dominion can only maintain control through genocide? Would confirm that the choice is between submission and annihilation with no middle ground. She shook her head. Your empire is built on the myth of benevolent hierarchy. High Admiral, the story you tell yourselves is that subjected species benefit from Dominion rule, that integration into your structure provides protection and advancement that they can never achieve alone. That myth is useful because it allows compliant populations to rationalize their servitude. But the myth only works if there's a choice. If the alternative to compliance is total destruction, the myth dies. And if the myth dies, you're not an empire anymore. You're just a tyranny holding power through terror. And tyrannies built on terror are inherently unstable. Vexrian stared at the human female for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting the dim lighting of the meeting room. She was describing a strategy that no species of Dominion had ever encountered had possessed the sophistication to attempt. A strategy that targeted not Dominion military capability, but Dominion political legitimacy. A strategy that sought not to destroy the Empire, but to make it destroy itself. You are more dangerous than I thought, he said finally. We are exactly as dangerous as we needed to become, Vasquez replied. Your species evolved in paradise and learned to rule through superiority. Our species evolved in hell and learned to survive through cunning. You came to our world expecting to find prey. You found predators who have been watching you approach and preparing the perfect trap. And what happens now? What is the next step in this perfect trap of yours? Vasquez stood, smoothing the fabric of her formal attire with a gesture that had become familiar over their many meetings. Now we wait. The Dominion High Council is debating how to respond to the loss of their colonial fleet. Our intelligence suggests they are divided between those who want to send an overwhelming force to destroy us immediately and those who recognize the strategic risks of such an action. We have been encouraging the cautious faction through various channels, giving them arguments against immediate retaliation. You are manipulating my government. We are influencing your government's decision-making process through carefully designed information campaigns. The techniques are thousands of years old on our world. We just apply them on an interstellar scale. She moved toward the door of the meeting room. The longer the council debates, the more time we have to strengthen our defenses and expand our alliance. The longer they delay, the more their subjected populations see that the mighty Dominion hesitates before a single world. The more they hesitate, the more others are encouraged to resist. You are counting on our own political divisions to weaken us from within. We are counting on the fundamental instability of any political structure built on coercion rather than consent. The Dominion has ruled for 40,000 years through force and the threat of force. But force is expensive, and the threat only works as long as it seems credible. We have demonstrated that it is not credible. Now we watch to see how your empire responds to the revelation. She paused at the door, looking back at Vexrian with an expression that might have been sympathy. I hope the cautious faction wins the debate, High Admiral, not because I fear what the aggressive faction would send against us, but because I know what we would have to do in response. We are very good at war. We have been practicing it against each other for our entire history, developing weapons and tactics and strategies that make your military doctrine look like children playing with toys. If your empire forces us to unleash our full capabilities, we will win. But the galaxy will be a much darker place afterward. Is that a threat? It is a statement of fact. Our species has always had the capacity for terrible violence. We have simply chosen to restrain it, to direct our aggressive instincts toward productive ends, to build civilizations instead of merely conquering them. But if you back us into a corner, if you threaten our survival as a species, those restraints will disappear. And then you will discover what a Deathworld truly produces when it is fighting for its life. She left, and Vexrian sat alone in the meeting room, contemplating a future that seemed darker than anything he had imagined when he first ordered his fleet into this system. The Dominion's response came 18 months after the battle. A massive armada of 300 dreadnoughts accompanied by countless support vessels and troop transports. The High Council had ultimately sided with the aggressive faction, convinced that only overwhelming force could restore their authority and prevent the spreading rebellion that humanity's victory had inspired. They assembled the largest fleet in Dominion history, stripped colonial garrisons and defensive installations throughout their territory to build an armada that they believed no single world could resist. They entered the human system expecting to face the same hidden defenses that had destroyed the colonial fleet. They found something far worse. The humans had used their 18 months of preparation to transform their entire star system into a fortress. The asteroid belt had been seeded with automated weapons platforms, each one containing a mass driver capable of accelerating projectiles to relativistic velocities. The gas giant's moons had been hollowed out and converted into shipyards, producing vessels at a rate that Dominion industrial planners had calculated was impossible for a single-system civilization. The inner planets were ringed with orbital defense stations, each one capable of projecting concentrated kinetic barges that could shred capital ships. And humanity's allied species had come to defend their new hope. The Veshkai remnant, survivors of the genocide that had reduced their homeworld to molten glass, had rebuilt themselves in human space over the preceding months. They brought with them the crystalline resonance technology that the Dominion had tried to destroy, adapted now for military applications that created interference patterns capable of disrupting energy shields. The Mindweaver descendants, liberated from the psychological conditioning that had broken their ancestors, contributed their telepathic abilities to coordinate the Allied fleet's movements with perfect synchronization. Dozens of other species, former Dominion subjects who had made their way to human space through the underground networks, added their own contributions. Technical expertise, material resources, soldiers willing to fight and die for the chance to strike back at their oppressors. The battle lasted 3 weeks. The Dominion fleet was the largest ever assembled, equipped with the most advanced technology their empire possessed, commanded by the High Council's most experienced military leaders. They were facing an alliance of former subjects and a primitive species that had achieved spaceflight barely a century ago. By every calculation the Dominion made, by every model their strategists developed, they should have achieved overwhelming victory. They did not. The humans had learned from their first engagement, studied the Dominion's tactics and technology, identified weaknesses, and developed counters. Their kinetic weapons had been refined, their guidance systems improved, their delivery platforms optimized for maximum effectiveness against energy-shielded targets. Their allied species contributed capabilities that the Dominion had never faced in combination, a synergy of technologies and abilities that create effects far greater than the sum of their parts. But more than weapons or allies, the humans brought something the Dominion could not match: experience with total war. The Dominion had fought countless conflicts in their 40,000-year history, but they had never faced a peer competitor. Their wars had been one-sided affairs, overwhelming displays of force against opponents who could not fight back. They had no concept of attritional strategy, of trading space for time, of accepting losses in pursuit of long-term victory. Their military doctrine was built on the assumption of rapid, decisive triumph through superior technology and numbers. The humans had spent their entire history fighting each other. They understood sieges that lasted years and wars that lasted generations. They understood the value of strategic depth, of defensive positions, of making the enemy pay for every meter of ground. They understood that victory was not measured in battles won, but in willingness to continue fighting. The Dominion fleet achieved tactical victories in the early engagements, their superior numbers and firepower forcing the Allied defenders to fall back from the outer system. But every victory cost them ships and crew that could not be replaced, while the humans and their allies retreated to prepared positions and waited for the next assault. The Dominion pushed forward, taking casualties at every step, until they finally reached the inner system and faced the main defensive installations. The battle for Earth itself was the most destructive engagement in recorded galactic history. The Dominion threw everything they had at the human homeworld, determined to destroy the source of the rebellion that was spreading throughout their empire. The humans responded with every weapon they possessed, holding nothing back, fighting with the desperate fury of a species defending its birthplace against extinction. The space around Earth became a graveyard of shattered vessels and expanding debris fields, a testament to the terrible price both sides were willing to pay. In the end, the Dominion broke, not because they had lost every ship, though their losses were catastrophic, not because they lacked the capability to continue fighting, though their remaining forces were a fraction of what they had brought into the system. They broke because they realized, finally and definitively, that victory was impossible. The humans would never surrender. The humans would fight until the last ship was destroyed, the last soldier killed, the last weapon exhausted. And even then, they would find ways to continue resisting, would wage guerrilla war among the debris fields and sabotage operations throughout Dominion territory, would make the cost of maintaining control exceed any possible benefit. The Dominion High Council, watching the battle from their capital world thousands of light years away, recognized the truth that their military commanders had been unwilling to accept. This was not a colonial operation that had gone wrong. This was an existential challenge to their entire way of existence. And they were losing. The armistice was signed 3 months later, in a ceremony that took place in the rebuilt plaza where Vexrian had first landed on Earth. The terms were simple, direct, and unprecedented in Dominion history. The Dominion recognized humanity as a sovereign civilization, entitled to the same rights and protections as any founding species of the galactic community. The Dominion withdrew all territorial claims to the Sol system and acknowledged humanity's right to expand into surrounding stellar neighborhood. The Dominion agreed to release all allied species who wished to leave their empire and resettle in human-protected space. And the Dominion accepted responsibility for the atrocities committed during their 40,000 years of imperial expansion, establishing a joint commission to document these crimes and provide reparations to the surviving victims. It was not peace, not truly. The Dominion still commanded vast resources and harbored deep resentment toward the species that had humiliated them. Human intelligence services reported that powerful factions within the High Council were already planning for the next conflict, building new weapons and developing new strategies to eventually bring humanity under Dominion control. The galaxy remained a dangerous place, filled with rival powers and unknown threats and eternal possibility of war. But for the first time in 40,000 years, the Dominion was not the unchallenged master of known space. For the first time, there was another power, another voice, another vision of what galactic civilization could become. And for the billions of beings who had lived their entire lives under Dominion domination, who had never known anything except servitude and the certain knowledge that resistance was futile, that change represented something more valuable than any military victory. It represented hope. Vexrian stood in the plaza where it had all begun, watching the delegation from the High Council sign the documents that ended their empire's ambitions in this region of space. He was still technically a prisoner, though the constraints on his movement had been relaxed considerably over the years of his captivity. The humans had offered to return him to the Dominion months ago, but he had declined. He found himself unable to face his former colleagues, unable to return to a society that would see him only as a commander who had lost an unlosable battle. Secretary General Vasquez approached him as the ceremony concluded, her hair now entirely gray, her face lined with the stress of leading humanity to the most dangerous period in its history. She looked tired but satisfied, the exhaustion of a marathon runner who has finally crossed the finish line. "It's done," she said simply. "For now." Vexrian's crest rose and fell in the Solari equivalent of a shrug. "Your intelligence services are correct. There are factions within the High Council that will never accept this outcome. They will plan and scheme and eventually try again. I know. We'll be ready. You always are, it seems." He turned to face her directly, his compound eyes meeting her soft human gaze. "I have been trying to understand your species for nearly 4 years now. I have studied your history, your culture, your psychology. I have spoken with your leaders and your common citizens, your scientists and your soldiers, and I still cannot fully comprehend what you are." "What do you mean?" "You are contradictions given flesh. You are capable of terrible cruelty and breathtaking compassion, often within the same individuals. You wage war with devastating efficiency and then risk everything to protect species that have no strategic value. You destroy my fleet without mercy and then treat me with consideration that no Dominion prisoner would ever receive." Vasquez smiled, expression that had become familiar to him over their long acquaintance. "We are what our world made us," she said. "A stop fighting. But we also learned that survival alone was not enough, that a species which knew only war would eventually destroy itself. So you learned to balance violence with compassion, aggression with cooperation. We learned that both were necessary, that the capacity for terrible destruction and the commitment to preserve life were not contradictions, but complements, that the greatest warriors were those who understood the value of peace, and the most effective peacemakers were those who knew how to wage war." She turned to look out over the plaza, at the representatives of a dozen species gathering to celebrate the armistice, at the human and alien children playing together in the shadow of monuments that commemorated the dead. "Your species came to our world expecting to find primitives. You thought our lack of energy shields made us weak, that our kinetic weapons were toys, that our fractured politics made us incapable of unified action. You were wrong about all of it." She paused. "But the mistake you made was deeper than that. You assumed that because you had never encountered a threat you couldn't defeat, no such threat existed. You assumed that 40,000 years of conquest proved something fundamental about the nature of power in the universe. And what did it actually prove? That you had been lucky, that you had expanded through a region of space that happened not to contain any peer competitors, that you had conquered species that happened not to possess a particular combination of traits necessary to resist you." She turned back to face him. "We were that competitor. We had those traits. And when you finally encountered us, you discovered that your 40,000 years of empire had taught you nothing about how to face a real challenge." Vexrian absorbed her words in silence, feeling the weight of 40 millennia of Dominion history pressing down on his scaled shoulders. Everything his species had believed about themselves, about their destiny, about their place in the universe, had been revealed as delusion. They were not the pinnacle of galactic evolution. They were not the inevitable masters of known space. They were simply one species among many, gifted with certain advantages and burdened with certain blindnesses, stumbling through existence like everyone else. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now we build something better." Vasquez's voice carried a conviction that seemed to transcend her physical exhaustion. The Dominion's empire was based on hierarchy and control, on the assumption that some species were inherently superior and others existed to serve them. "We're going to offer a different model. A community of equals, working together not because they're forced to but because they choose to, sharing knowledge and resources and protection, growing stronger through cooperation rather than conquest." A noble vision. But visions often founder on the reality of competing interests and scarce resources. True, which is why we're not merely preaching ideals. We're building institutions, establishing procedures, creating mechanisms for resolving disputes without warfare. It won't be perfect. Nothing involving multiple intelligent species ever is. But it will be better than the alternative. And what of the Dominion? What role do you see for my species in this noble community of yours? Vasquez studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "That depends on you. Not you personally, but your species as a whole. The Dominion has a choice to make. You can continue down the path of empire, fighting to maintain control over populations that no longer fear you, bleeding resources in endless suppression operations while the galaxy moves on without you. Or you can adapt, recognize that the universe has changed, that the old ways no longer work, and find a new role for yourselves in the community we're building. You would accept us? After everything we have done, we would give you the opportunity to earn acceptance. Redemption is possible, High Admiral, but it must be chosen and worked for. We cannot force you to change. We can only offer the chance and hope you take it." She reached out and placed her hand on his scaled forearm, a gesture of connection that crossed a vast gulf between their species. "Your world is not a death world," she said quietly. "Ours is. And because we evolved surrounded by danger, we learned something that you never had to. We learned that survival requires more than strength. It requires wisdom and adaptability and the capacity to recognize when old strategies have failed and new approaches are needed. You think the Dominion is capable of learning this lesson? I think every species is capable of learning, given sufficient motivation. Your motivation is the survival of your civilization in a galaxy that is no longer willing to accept Dominion rule. Either you adapt, or you fade into history like every empire that came before you. She released his arm and stepped back, her expression shifting from intimate to formal as the other delegations began to approach for the post-ceremony reception. Whatever you decide, High Admiral, know that we will be watching and preparing, because that is what we do. It is what our world taught us to do, and it is what will keep us alive no matter what challenges the galaxy sends our way. Vexrian watched her walk away, joining her fellow humans and their alien allies in the celebration of an armistice that might lead to lasting peace or might merely be a pause before the next conflict. He found himself hoping, for the first time in his long career, that the former would prove true, not because he feared human capabilities, though he did, not because he doubted Dominion power, though he now understood its limits, but because he had glimpsed, in his years among these impossible creatures, something that his own species had lost somewhere in their 40,000 years of supremacy. The humans remembered what it was to be vulnerable, to face threats that seemed insurmountable and fight anyway, to lose and rebuild, fall and rise, die and be reborn. Their Deathworld had forged them in fire, and the fire had never stopped burning. They called their philosophy many things in their fragmented languages: resilience, determination, stubbornness. But the name that stuck, the one that their children would carry to the stars and beyond, was simpler. Humanity, fuck yeah. The phrase had originated in their entertainment media, a celebration of their species' capacity to overcome adversity through sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat. It had become a rallying cry during the first battle, transmitted between human ships as they dismantled the colonial fleet. It had spread to the allied species during the long siege, a verbal touchstone that reminded everyone fighting alongside humanity why these strange, soft creatures inspired such loyalty. Vexrian had heard it countless times during his captivity. He had asked about it, studied it, tried to understand why 3 simple words could carry such emotional weight. And in the end, standing in the plaza where his species' ambitions had first run aground against human reality, he finally understood. It was not a boast. It was not a threat. It was a statement of identity, a declaration of the fundamental nature that their world had burned into them across billions of years of evolution and millions of years of civilization. They were survivors. They were fighters. They were the children of a world that tried to kill them every day and had produced, in response, a species that could not be killed. The galaxy had thought they knew what to expect from Earth. They had looked at the blue oceans and the green forests and seen paradise. They had not understood that paradise was an illusion, that beneath the beautiful surface was a world of volcanoes and earthquakes, ice ages and asteroid impacts, predators and parasites, and a million creative ways to die. They had not understood that the most dangerous thing on that dangerous world was the soft, clever ape that had learned to survive everything it threw at them. Now they knew. The humans were awake. The humans were aware of the galaxy and their place in it. The humans were building alliances and developing technologies and preparing for whatever challenges the universe might send their way. And the universe, for the first time in a very long time, had reason to be worried, because when a death world defends at home, nothing in existence is safe. Nothing is certain. Nothing is guaranteed except the absolute, unwavering, unbreakable determination of a species that had learned to fight before it learned to walk. Vexrian turned away from the celebration and walked slowly toward the edge of the plaza, where a viewing platform overlooked the sprawling human city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that his compound eyes processed as something hauntingly beautiful. Somewhere above that painted sky, the debris fields of 2 shattered fleets still orbited, slowly dispersing into the void. Monuments to miscalculation, gravestones for the old order. A young human approached him, a female barely past adolescence by their standards, wearing the uniform of what they called the United Nations Space Command. She stopped a respectful distance away, her posture suggesting uncertainty about how to address a former enemy commander. "Hi, Admiral Vexrian." Her voice was steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I'm Cadet Elena Vasquez. The Secretary General is my grandmother." She asked me to find you. Vexrian's crest shifted in surprise. Your grandmother wishes to speak with me again? No, sir. She wanted me to give you this. The cadet extended her hand, offering a small data crystal. She said you've been asking questions about our species for years. She said this might help you understand. Vexrian accepted the crystal, turning it over in his scaled fingers. What does it contain? Our history. The real history, not the sanitized version we show to tourists and diplomats. The wars we fought against each other. The atrocities we've committed. The times we nearly destroyed ourselves. The cadet's expression was somber. My grandmother said that if you want to understand humanity, you need to see what we're capable of at our worst. Only then will you understand why we work so hard to be better. Why would she share such information with a former enemy? The cadet smiled, an expression that reminded Vexrian powerfully of her grandmother despite the decades between them. Because you're not our enemy anymore, sir. You're a guest, and guests deserve honesty, even when the truth is uncomfortable. She saluted crisply, a gesture that Vexrian had learned to recognize as a sign of respect, then turned and walked back toward the celebration. He watched her go, this child of a species that had humbled the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known, and felt something shift in his understanding. The Dominion had conquered through superiority. They had demanded submission and punished resistance. They had built an empire on the assumption that strength alone determined who ruled and who served. The humans were building something different. They were building on honesty, on shared struggle, on the recognition that every species had darkness in its past and the choice to reach for light in its future. They were not pretending to be better than they were. They were acknowledging their flaws and working to overcome them. It was, Vexrian realized, a far more difficult path than conquest. And perhaps, for that very reason, a far more durable foundation for civilization. He activated the data crystal and began to read. Epilogue. 50 years later. The chamber was vast, built to accommodate representatives from over 200 species. Holographic displays translated proceedings into hundreds of languages simultaneously, while environmental systems maintained zones of varying atmosphere, temperature, and gravity to suit the diverse physiologies present. The Galactic Assembly had grown far beyond anything its founders had imagined, and today it faced a challenge that would test everything it had built. Ambassador Vexrian of the Solari Reformation stood at the central podium, his scales now dull with age, but his crest still proud. 50 years had passed since the battle that had ended one era and begun another. 50 years of negotiation and reconstruction, of old enemies becoming cautious allies and cautious allies becoming genuine friends. The Dominion had fractured in the decades following their defeat, conservative factions retreating into isolationism, while progressive elements sought to build new relationships with the expanding community of free species. Vexrian had become the face of that progressive movement. His unique perspective as both former conqueror and reformed advocate making him an effective bridge between old powers and new possibilities. The motion before this assembly, he announced, his voice carrying across the vast chamber through translation systems that rendered his words in perfect local idiom for every listener, is whether to extend membership to the Kethvari Collective. A murmur rippled to the gathered representatives. The Kethvari were a recently contacted species from the far side of the galaxy, a civilization that had developed in complete isolation and possessed technology unlike anything the Assembly had encountered. Their arrival had sparked both excitement and concern. Excitement at the prospect of new knowledge and perspectives, concern about how to integrate a power that had no history with the existing community. The debates had been extensive. Some argued that the Kethvari's advanced technology made them a potential threat, that accepting them into the Assembly risked destabilizing the careful balance that had been built over decades. Others countered that isolation was no solution, that the Assembly's strength came from its diversity, and that rejecting the Kethvari would only guarantee future conflict. But the voice that mattered most had not yet spoken. The Assembly recognizes a representative from Earth. Admiral Elena Vasquez rose from her seat in the human delegation, her gray hair cut short in military fashion, her posture straight despite her advanced years. She had served in the Second Battle of Earth, commanded human forces during the liberation of Proxima Centauri, and spent the last 2 decades as humanity's primary voice in galactic affairs. When she spoke, The chamber fell silent. 50 years ago, she began, her voice carrying the weight of history, a fleet came to my world with the intention of conquest. They saw us as primitives, as potential servants, as a problem to be solved through superior force. They were wrong about us, and their mistake cost them an empire. She paused, her eyes sweeping across the assembled representatives. We could have responded to that attempted conquest with hatred. We could have dedicated ourselves to revenge, to the destruction of everyone who had ever supported Dominion expansion. Many argued that we should, that the only way to ensure our safety was to become what our enemies had been, conquerors who would never again be threatened because we had eliminated everyone capable of threatening us. Her gaze found Vexrian at the podium, and something passed between them. An acknowledgement of shared history, of the long road they had traveled together. We chose differently. We chose to believe that the future could be better than the past, that species which had been enemies could become allies, that the cycle of conquest and resistance could be broken, not through victory, but through the harder work of building something worth preserving. She turned to face the section of the chamber where the Kethvari delegation waited, their crystalline forms shimmering with patterns that their translators rendered as intense attention. The Kethvari are unknown to us. Their technology is unfamiliar. Their culture is strange. We cannot predict with certainty how they will act as members of this assembly. A slight smile crossed her weathered features. But that uncertainty is not a reason to reject them. It is a reason to welcome them. Because every species sitting in this chamber was unknown once. Every civilization represented here took a risk by joining with others. And every time we have taken that risk, we have grown stronger for it. She straightened, her voice ringing with conviction. Humanity votes to accept the Kethvari Collective into the Galactic Assembly. We do this not because we are certain of the outcome, but because we believe in the possibility of peace. We do this not because it is safe, but because it is right. And we do this because 50 years ago, we learned that the galaxy is too large and too dangerous for any species to face alone. The vote was held. The motion passed. As the chamber erupted in the carefully modulated celebrations of 200 different species, Vexrian descended from the podium and made his way to the human delegation. Elena Vasquez met him halfway, her hand extended in that gesture of greeting that had become universal throughout assembly space. "Well spoken, Admiral," he said, clasping her small hand in his scaled grip. "Your grandmother would have been proud. My grandmother taught me that hope is not naivety. It's a choice we make every day, in the face of every reason not to." She smiled. "She also taught me that the universe is full of surprises, that the species you expect to be your enemies might become your greatest friends, if you give them the chance." She was a remarkable woman. She was human. Elena's smile widened. "We're all remarkable, High Admiral. Every species in this chamber. Every civilization that chose to reach for the stars instead of hiding in the dark. That's what this assembly represents. Not the triumph of one species over others, but the collective decision to be better than our origins." They stood together, watching the celebrations unfold. Crystalline Veshkai dancing with massive Kethvari, telepathic mind weavers sharing emotional impressions with species that had no concept of psychic communication, Solari delegates mingling freely with the descendants of those they had once conquered. The galaxy was not perfect. Conflict still arose, disagreement still festered, and the threat of war was never entirely absent. But the foundation held. The community endured. The choice to build rather than destroy continued to be made, day after day, species after species, world after world. "Do you ever wonder," Vexrian asked quietly, "what would have happened if we had won? If my fleet had succeeded in conquering your world?" Elena considered the question for a long moment. "Sometimes. But then I remember what my grandmother told me, the last time I saw her before she died. She said that the Dominion could never have truly conquered Earth. That even if you had destroyed our fleet and bombarded our cities and enslaved our population, you would never have broken us. We would have resisted. We would have adapted. We would have found ways to fight back that you couldn't predict or prevent. Because you are survivors. Because we are stubborn." She laughed. a sound that carried echoes of countless human generations who had laughed in the face of impossible odds. We evolved on a world that tried to kill us every day. We fought ice ages and volcanoes and each other. We built civilizations and watched them fall, and built new ones on the ruins. We are the children of a planet that never stopped testing us, and we never stopped passing those tests. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. You know what my grandmother's last words were? She was 93 years old, lying in a hospital bed, knowing she didn't have much time left. And she looked at me and smiled and said, "We made it, Elena. We made it. Made it to the future she dreamed of, the one where her granddaughter could stand in a chamber full of alien species and argue for peace instead of war. The one where the enemies who tried to conquer her world will become the allies who help build something better." Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. She spent her whole life working toward this moment, and she got to see it, even if only from a distance. She got to know that it was possible. Vexrian was silent for a long moment, processing the weight of what she had shared. Then, slowly, his crest rose and Solari gestured profound respect. "Your species," he said, "remains the most extraordinary I've ever encountered. Not because of your weapons or your technology or your tactical brilliance, but because of your capacity to hope, to believe in futures that do not yet exist and work to bring them into being. That's not uniquely human. High Admiral, look around you." Elena gestured at the celebrating crowd. Every species here chose hope over despair. Every civilization represented in this chamber decided that the future could be better than the past. We're not special. We're just the ones who happen to be in a position to remind everyone else that the choice was possible. Perhaps. Vexrian's compound eyes swept across the diverse assembly. But you were the first in 40,000 years to make the Dominion face that choice. And because you did, all of this became possible. The celebrations continued long into the night, as they always did when the assembly welcomed a new member. The Kethvari delegates mingled with their new colleagues, learning the protocols and customs of community they had just joined. Trade agreements were discussed, cultural exchanges planned, scientific collaborations proposed. The work of building a better galaxy went on, as it had for 50 years, as it would for centuries to come. And somewhere in the vast chamber, surrounded by the representatives of species that had once been enemies and were now friends, an old Solari admiral and an old human diplomat shared a drink that neither of their physiologies was designed to process, toasting to the memory of the woman who had seen the future and refused to let it slip away. "To Elena Vasquez," Vexrian said, raising his glass. "To my grandmother," the younger Elena agreed, "and to everyone who chose hope." They drank. The celebrations continued. The galaxy turned on, vast and ancient and full of dangers that no one species could face alone. But they were not alone anymore. They were together, and that made all the difference.